So now that this chart is basically filled out, we can start to analyze not just how each vision sees the world and various political issues, but we can also start to see how the two sides interact with each other. In parts 5 and 6 of this series, I isolated the right and the left separately and did a logical deduction from a Darwinian perspective as to how each side shaped up. So you can watch those videos if you want to see why I believe these charts are accurate. But yeah, those are long videos just because there's a lot here. Now, one point I made in part 2 of this series is that the matriarchal view, it evolved basically dealing with internal domestic affairs, and the patriarchal view dealt with these external affairs. But then the political realm is like this weird third layer that popped up in the middle all of a sudden. So what's happening is that each vision is kind of stepping onto the same turf in a way that they did not before. They used to stay separately. So, whichever set of colored glasses you're wearing, you're going to naturally think that your vision is the right way of seeing that realm because it's the only one you have. But then when the other side steps in with the different color glasses, they start acting in a way that, if you look at these charts, they look like basically opposites, right? So when you see that person operating with that opposite vision, you don't realize they have that opposite vision because historically everyone in the same domain had the same vision. Now all of a sudden you have people with the opposite vision. There's going to be quite a bit of conflict, especially if you don't understand why they have that opposite vision. Now, when you look at this chart more closely, though, you realize that these are not quite polar opposites from each other. There are subtle differences that make them not quite exactly the same. So, but what happens is a lot of times each side will project their own vision on the other side with the opposite motivation, right? So for example, the most basic example, and I talked about this a little bit in part 6, but this line right here, the left wants to decrease the variance, the right wants to increase the average. If the left wants to decrease the variance, they project the opposite motivation onto the right. So they think that the right wants to increase the variance. The right does not want to increase the variance. They want to increase the average because that's what quality control is, right? And likewise, when the right looks at the left, they see the left is crazy because they see the precedents they set and so on as something that threatens to, by threatening quality control, it threatens to decrease the average. Well, the left doesn't want to decrease the average per se. They want to decrease the variance. So they're not quite opposites. However, they are in many cases correlated. Right, if you remember the example from part 6 about the two lines or the two status points, the two outcomes here versus the bigger gap up here, there is often a correlation between variance and average. So in that simple example, you can see how the main goal of one is the side effect of the other. Right? So if you increase the average, you may increase the variance as a side effect. But if you want to decrease the variance, you may accidentally end up decreasing the average as a side effect. Okay? So each one has a different vision of what's important. So they're noticing the other. They're projecting a polar opposite motivation, which is not quite right. So an example of this would be a specific political example in the modern era of this right here is Trump's MAGA slogan, right? So the left, when they project their own vision with the opposite motivation onto Trump, they think he wants to increase the variance. They're interpreting "Make America Great Again" in a relative sense, right? But he's not thinking that. He's actually thinking of it in an absolute sense. Right. And likewise, it's also tied to this stuff up here that, since the left wing progressives think that, the whole world should be more egalitarian, Trump's message of America first is just it doesn't mind other people being prosperous, but it's just not his job because he has a much more limited control over the world. It's not, he's not there for the earth, he's there for the United States, right? So, but the point is that when you project direct opposite motivations, you get kind of twisted versions, right? So that's where you get like this, the supremacy allegations are made from a relative viewpoint, but that vision doesn't actually have a relative viewpoint. Another difference is something I touched on in the last video, is that although these are almost opposites, they also disagree asymmetrically on where the levers of society lie. So the example I used in the last video was, and I haven't, it's only been a couple days, I haven't had the time to think of a better way to put this, but I pointed these two lines out right here. So the left thinks that this is a lever of control, that we can decide how much we cooperate versus compete. Whereas the right competes not because it wants to, but because it has to, right? And then the opposite happens here, right? So the right tries to encourage self-sufficiency, whereas this is not really seen as a lever of control, right? So when it comes to your focal points versus your blind spots, your focal point is going to be where you think the control lies, right? So, and things that you think are inevitable are going to be kind of a blind spot. So the discussion, whenever you see a political debate, like the Jordan Peterson, Cathy Newman example that I showed last time, when Cathy Newman's trying to bring this point home about how, everyone should cooperate, Peterson doesn't just disagree directly. He thinks it's kind of pointless to bring that up because, something that's inevitable, that's not where the lever of society is, right? Your lever of society should be in your own individual self-sufficiency and in your own action. So for the rest of this video, I just want to bring up a couple of political issues as examples for demonstrating the nature of this subconscious asymmetric warfare. The first one is very appropriate for the day, elections and voting. So if you've been paying attention to the issue, you've noticed that both the left and the right accuse one another of foul play during elections. However, they accuse each other of different things. So the right will accuse the left of cheating, the left will accuse the right of suppression. So what does this mean? Well, according to the right, you'll see just if you look at its moral compass, it sees voting as a process. Okay, so they will look at it in kind of this sports ethics lens, right? They want the quality control, right? Because what they will consider cheating is, it's a bad precedent, right? If one person can get away with it, then 100 people will get away with it, then 1 million people will get away with it, right? That's how sports works. That's why you always have to tighten the screws on officiating a sporting event, because, when people are trying to win, they're going to do whatever you allow them to get away with, right? That's just how this moral compass works. So what they're always trying to do is tighten the screws on security and the process, right? They want to make sure, when thinking about how to cheat a process, right, make sure that, some person doesn't vote twice or vote when they're dead and all these kinds of things, right? But it's always about securing the nature of this process. Okay, there's this, the left will say things like, well, are you going to accept the results of the election? Well, yes, the right will accept the results of the election on the condition that they accept the process. If the right accepts the process of the election, then they will accept the results of the election. But that is the condition, okay? Right? It's the means justify the ends. It's consistent. It's everything here. I feel like I'm repeating myself just how natural it is. But how does the left view voting and elections? They don't actually view it through this lens, okay? They view it through their own lens. So if their perception of voting and elections confuses you, look right here at this cell, okay? They see voting as a provision, right? The same as other provisions I went over in the last video. Just like food and clothing and shelter, voting, they call it a right, and that's the word I avoid using because a right means something different on either, and I'll get into that in a later video. To be more precise in the language, it's a provision. When the left talks about rights, they're talking about provisions. So they see voting as a provision, something just like those other things. Isn't something that you are entitled to by the nature of your existence. That's why they were the ones that pushed universal suffrage in the first place, right? They see it in this provision light, right? So what happens when they start in this asymmetric warfare I've been talking about, when the right starts tightening the screws on security, the left isn't thinking about the process because they don't have a process-based moral compass. Instead, they start thinking about how many ballots will be thrown out. You see? Yes, if you tighten the screws on security, that will likely result in some extra ballots being thrown out. But as I've been referring to in this video before, that's a side effect. When the left projects its own moral compass onto the other side, they see that throwing out of the ballots as the direct intention of the other side. It's not. It's the process that they're worried about, that as a side effect might result in some extra ballots being thrown out. Whether those ballots are, and those are two different categories. You can have some ballots being thrown out because they are genuinely invalid, or you could have some that should have been counted, but, were thrown out by an extra secure process. Either way, the left-wing lens isn't necessarily going to be as concerned with differentiating between those two cases. The right is going to be hyper-focused on it, right? They would rather have all of the proper process get through and those that did not go through the process get thrown out. But the left is not going to think of it that way. They're going to see it as a provision, so they're going to want as many ballots to count as possible. Then, of course, the right, their alarm bells go off, and they start thinking about the precedent that they set. But you can see how the focus being in a different spot ultimately results in a different nature of the two accusations. The second issue I want to bring up is quotas. Whether we're talking about the old affirmative action programs up to the more broad case of diversity initiatives in hiring. If you are not attuned to this way of thinking that promotes this stuff, once again, it's the same thing as it is with voting. In the left-wing mindset, a job is a type of provision. And I don't mean a job, you get a job to provide for your family. I mean, politically, a job is something provided to you. By having a job, I am now provided, right? You think of a job or a college admission, a degree, whatever, in the same category of provision as receiving food, water, clothing, shelter, right? That kind of thing, right? So you start using that left-wing logic that I described in detail in part 6, right? Which is, in the rationing sort of way, right? Where you look across the field and who has what, right? And everybody's got their Maslow's hierarchy of needs. You always attend to the one of lowest status first, right? The one, because they're the ones that are considered to have the most urgent needs. So then you prop them up, right? And so when you have a zero-sum game, such as there are finite number of admissions at a school or finite number of hiring positions, yeah, when you admit someone artificially, you got to kick someone out artificially. And so that's where, you end up punishing good status, but really the goal here, the imperative, the focal point is rewarding the bad status, the urgent need. But yeah, if you think abstractly of a job as something that is being given to someone as a necessary provision, and you just work that logic, then you can start to understand why they do what they do, okay? But then they fail to understand the other side as well because, they project that opposite motivation. Oh, you just don't want the people of bad status to be provided for. But that's not it. When you look at the other side, you'll see that the right actually views jobs with a task-oriented approach. You do a job because there's a job that needs doing and it needs to be done well, right? So the criticism of affirmative action is that, when you are allowing lower qualified students into the finite number of seats at the college, you're actually, you're lowering the quality of the education, right? Because now you are, the bottom of the class has actually been dragged down because you are, admitting people in with lower scores, right? So if you're artificially giving someone, say, a medical degree, do you really want this person, performing open heart surgery on you now if they were a lower performing student that was artificially propped up by this program, right? So when you're thinking of the quality of the actual job being done, you don't understand why this is going on and you object to it. But then this side also doesn't understand this side for the reason that I just explained. So once again, the two sides talk over each other's heads. So the other issue I want to touch on is this topic of division. In the United States, both sides are accusing the other of dividing the country, right? Shia LaBeouf had his chant, "He will not divide us," talking about Trump. But I've also heard a lot of people say this, basically the same thing about Obama. So what's going on here? I think it's a simple explanation would just be, that phrase, "accuse your enemy of that which you yourself are doing." But I think we can get a much more precise explanation with the chart here. So we can look at each side one at a time once again. In the case of the right accusing the left, I think that the pressure point to examine on this one is this guy down here. I'm going to stick to this term here, no double standards. I do believe the typical term here is equality of opportunity. I think this term is both more accurate and more broad. And so I think that it's more important. And standards, by the way, is talking about standards of behavior, right? This is the verb-based moral compass, etc., right? So this is the thing that the right values when it's talking about unity. So I think a great example is, once again, to touch on the sports thing, Jackie Robinson. Jackie Robinson was not just a black baseball player. He was a great baseball player. Okay, so what happened was when he burst into the league, people looked around. I mean, he was such an entertaining player to watch and a great player. People just kind of looked around and realized, we are lowering the quality of our sport by excluding him, right? So it just kind of opened people's minds to removing the double standard. Oh, well, you're black, you have to be over there, and you're not going to have these opportunities, right? This idea is that no, the whole playing field is innately open to everybody, right? So that's what led to this culture of, I don't care whether you're white or black, man or woman, gay or straight, you have the same hiring opportunity, right? It's not just opportunity. That's why I think this is broader, but this term is ultimately better. But the point is that you can see how this goes against exactly what I was saying a minute ago about affirmative action, because that is innately a double standard, right? Letting people in off on a lower score or whatever, right? So the unification on this side was on this standard of behavior thing, right? I don't care if you're, in all these different groups, we all have, we are unified in being judged by our actions. As Martin Luther King Jr. said, the content of our character. At least that's how the right interprets the content of your character. It's shown through your actions. I talked about that window into your soul thing in part 5 as well, right? So they accuse the left of being divisive because these different groups now matter, and you have different standards of behavior being applied to each, right? In the affirmative action case, right? And as well as all these other different facets of identity politics, these double standards are being created. Now, as I've explained, the left doesn't see it as a double standard. So kind of switching to the other side here. Well, first off, they don't care about no double standards. That's over here on the right, right? This is standard of action. They have a noun-based moral compass, right? So that it's a blind spot to them. They don't care about the double standard, but their provision goal in this optimized rationing, the whole process is a double standard. So, but why don't they care? They don't care, or let me put it this way. Why don't they see themselves as divisive? Why is it the other side that they're calling divisive? I think the answer to that is this right here. The matriarchal lens already sees people divided up like this, right? Mama Bear doesn't decree who Papa Bear and Baby Bear is, right? They're already like this, right? Mama Bear feels no obligation to avoid double standards between Papa Bear and Baby Bear. Obviously. She's used to a huge double standard there, right? Because in that paradigm, there should be a double standard. So they don't care about the double standard, right? What they care about is the outcome, right? So when they put everybody into all these groups, they're not, in their minds, they're not placing them in these groups. These groups just are already there, and then they're judging the outcome, the provision of these groups, right? So then they, in their minds, they're just engaging in this natural process that matriarchs have always participated in, which is find Papa Bear, take his resource, and give it to Baby Bear. Now, in the current paradigm, the social justice ideology, by the way, it's kind of moved away as we've seen kind of Marxism evolve. We've kind of moved away from pure economic Marxism, where the thing being distributed is resources in that needs-based way. It's kind of morphed into this racial privilege juju thing, right? So you have a certain amount of privilege, and this other person is underprivileged, and so we're going to redistribute the privilege. So we're going to go to Papa Bear, the white male, and take his racial privilege juju and redistribute it to all the baby bears, right? That's kind of their process, okay? So then that's their thinking. So what happens is when they then look across the aisle to the other side, and those people are not willing to do that, in my assessment, essentially what's going on is it breaks their brains, right? Mama Bear has always been able to go to Papa Bear and take the resources and redistribute, right? This natural process, it's happened throughout all families, right? It's supposed to be, that's why you went out there and got the resources. It's here to be distributed. So all of a sudden in this political realm, it isn't happening. All of a sudden, he's going into the basement and locking all the bags of goodies away, right? And selfishly keeping everyone else from being provided for as they need to be. Right? This has never happened before. This is horrible, right? I think that this is the thing that makes them go crazy, because there's nothing in this paradigm that's prepared for this. They have this utter moral contempt for the right because they see this as just this process is being interrupted and they don't know what to do. So yeah, when they hear these things like, I don't care whether you're a man or a woman, white or black, gay or straight, they actually see this as a horrible thing, right? Because they're looking in that paradigm of seeing where everyone is in a needs-based basis, right? And they're seeing you, when you say that, as being insensitive to their needs, right? So that's where they start calling you divisive, right? Because now you're the one that's hoarding all the racial juju or whatever. You're the one that's holding on to your privilege and not attending to people's needs, right? Whereas their own categorization of putting these people in these identity groups, to them, it's just a natural process that they've always done in order to figure out who needs what. Anyway, this video has gone on longer than I intended once again, but there's definitely much more to say on it. So if you thought it was helpful, please leave the usual interactions and I will continue this next time.